What we're going to do today, though, is I already sewed it onto the front, and then we're going to fold it over to the back. So normally what I do first is I take it over here to the ironing table, and all of these steps that I'm going to do right now are probably a lot more steps than the average person would do to put on their binding. And that's okay. You do what you want to do. There is nothing that says you can't do it really fast and, not iron it or do whatever. This is just what I do. Because, excuse me a second. I don't know what's going on with my throat today. Anyway, I just do it this way because it's just easier for me to try to get the binding to look like I want. And I still, still not perfect. I'm still working on it. I'm like obsessed with finding the perfect method to put on binding where it looks perfect, I guess. I don't know. But I have more success if I just iron the binding from the front or whichever side it was put on. And some of you are probably just, shaking your head going, I ain't doing that. And that's okay. You don't have to. I do that a lot when I see other people's videos. I'm like, hell no, I'm not doing that. But sometimes I'll try stuff, just so I can see if I like it. And sometimes you have to try it more than once because you're never going to be good at anything just doing it one time. Always have to have scissors around somewhere because you always have threads coming up where you don't want them. My dog finally decided to come downstairs and visit. And she's usually right where I'm at all the time, under my feet. She sleeps with me. And last night she didn't. She didn't sleep with me. She didn't come see me in the morning. She hasn't been downstairs all day. Kind of feeling unloved. Alright. Oh, goodness. Breakfast is smelling pretty good. Alright, so got it kind of, laying flatter. And then I'm just going to start on the back and cut threads because I just can't stand all these threads everywhere. So your corners, you can start in the corner, and for corners, this corner is it's folded towards this way, so you want your binding on the back or the front or wherever you're putting it to fold the opposite way of that corner. So they kind of nest. They're not really going to nest, but they're going to nest a little bit. And then just fold the corner down. And sometimes if the corners are kind of bulky like that and that's not laying flat, just give it a couple of little taps there, flatten it out, and you'll get a nicer corner. So I'm just going to put a clip on the corner right now, just to hold it where I want it. And then I'm going to kind of look at the binding. And so it wants to lay right now with a little bit of a gap. Let's see. it's almost a quarter of an inch if I put it exactly right next to uh, what is this ruler? Oh, here we go. Yeah, it's about a quarter of an inch. If I put it right next to the edge of the serging. You can try to move it up a little bit so it's, you know, right next to the serging, but then you're not going to have it full all the way to the edge, and then your corner might not meet exactly. So I'm just going to lay it right next to the edge, and my serger width can't get any wider, so if it could, I would definitely make it wider. For some reason, sometimes it on the last one on the sample I did, it was actually almost the same width. If you use 2 1/4, you're going to get it where it kind of lines up exactly with that serger, so you're going to get more of a binding that is the same on both sides. And then I just put white Elmer's glue in a little bottle like this, and just run a bead and just fold it over and iron it down, trying to get it even. And like I said, you're probably going to look at this and say, well, why is she going through all those steps? And I'm just going to put it on my machine and do it the way I do it. That's fine. But I want to know what it looks like before I start stitching, so maybe I'm just a little too anal about it, and it's not even like it still comes out perfect, because it doesn't. But it makes me feel better, so. And this is just called glue basting, and it makes it easy. I don't have to worry about clips and all that. I do this before I hand stitch it down too, so that it just stays where I want it, and I don't have to worry about clips and stuff. And it's just a little tiny bit of glue. It's not very much. So we're coming to the other corner, and we're just going to fold it a nice angle. Might give it a little bit of a tapping just so it flattens out a little bit. And it has a beautiful corner. So I'll just put a clip in there. It's actually, binding's actually looking pretty good. Again, if you hand stitched it, it would look amazing. Then you can put a little bit of glue on this side, and then underneath the corner. Sometimes I get a little overzealous and I get glue everywhere on the corners. But it comes out when you wash it. And then I'm just going to continue gluing this down, and then I'll show you how I sew it on. I started to stitch on the binding, and then I decided I needed to change to the darker monofilament. This one is called Smoke, and I think it looks better on black fabric. I'm going to keep the clear in the bobbin and put the Smoke on top. Okay, I'm ready to stitch on this binding, and just going, I actually changed my width of my zigzag, so I'm using a zigzag stitch. And I put the width at 1 and the length at Actually, I think I'm going to change it. The width at 1 and the length at 2.5. I originally was going to start with a 1.5 and width and a 3 millimeter length, but I didn't like it, so you can change your mind. And so you just want one part of the zigzag to catch one side of the binding and the other to go off onto the background. If you're using a zigzag. So I'm going to take a look at it, and I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to continue. This walking foot that the baby lock has, it's really big in the back. So it's hard to get stuff under it sometimes. But I love this walking foot. I love this baby lock for the most part. I could do without it moving and on the embroidery with the foot down, but that's my only complaint. Okay, I am going to finish sewing this on, and I'll have you look at it when I'm done. We're going to talk about different kind of bindings real quick, and I have some samples here. So you can sew your binding onto the back of your quilt and then do a top stitch along the edge and sew it down. On this particular sample, I just used regular thread and sewed it down. But you can see on the back I kind of overlapped the binding, and I don't like that. I got it a little too close because I don't like one side of my binding being wider than the other. So I got this one a little bit too close, so I probably wouldn't sew it on like this again. And the other problem with this is 2.5 inch binding, and the problem is sometimes it'll overlap your piecing, kind of like it has in this block. So here's a little sample I made when I was trying to do my decorative stitch, and that's kind of what that looks like. I always make samples. This sample is probably the one that I like the best. This is a 2.5 inch binding, and like I said, I don't like the binding to be too wide on the back, and I like it to be nice and full, and I like the corners to be square. So on this sample, I shifted my needle 0.75 to the left because I was using a 2.5 inch binding. And then I used monofilament Superior Threads monofilament thread to sew a little zigzag on the back, and it kind of looks like it's been hand bound, and that's the one I like the most if I'm going to machine bind. It's not the one I always use though. Sometimes I get lazy and I'll just do a straight stitch. On this sample, I have sewed the binding on the front, and this is a 2.25 inch binding, and I usually use a 2.25 inch binding because it gives me about the same width on the front and the back without having to make a lot of adjustments. But you can see, I don't know, it's a very tiny little flange, and it's really not that bad. You wash it, you're not going to be able to see it, but I still don't like it as much as doing the zigzag. And this is what the front looks like. It's another sample, 2.25 inch binding, and I don't know what I did on this one. but I don't like it. It looks like I overstitched the front and the back, so yeah, don't like that one. Here's a example of doing binding with a beaded flange or a beaded piping. And this piping is hand sewn, and it's sewn in between each one of these beads, and it takes a very long time. But, and then it's hand sewn on the back. This example, sewn on the front, and it has a zigzag with the monofilament thread on the back. And this is a 0.5 zigzag. It's really not much of a zigzag. Actually, I like it at 0.1. And I did a really good job on this one. It's pretty close to the binding on the front, but it didn't overstitch the front. Another example, this is 2¼ inch binding, and I only had to shift it 0.5 to get it where I wanted. And this is, of course, on my baby lock. I just tested some on my Bernina, and it was different. So every machine is different, so you have to take that into account. This one has a piping. It's actually a pretty good size piping. It looks like a nice little pot holder, and it has all these little doodads. And then you have a false back sewn on here, and then you have to hand sew it down. This is bias binding, and I didn't write down how big it was, but it's hand sewn on the back. And it has the beaded flange, or the beaded piping. So this example is what I'm talking about. When you sew your binding on with 1/4 inch, and this is a 2½ inch binding. And then this is what it looks like on the back. It's all wide. If you try to get it nice and straight next to the edge of the quilt, so you don't have any bagginess right here. And I hate that. I think it looks ugly. But that doesn't mean you don't like it, so don't take my comments as gospel. I am not an expert. I'm just telling you what I like. And then, of course, you're going to be able to see where you stitched on the front more than if you used a smaller binding, or if it was smaller. And I don't like this one at all. And so then in this example, this is a 2½ inch binding, and it was put on with 1/4 inch seam. Sorry, I got a bunch of threads around here. And on the back, I tried to get it just about 1/8 inch away from the stitch line. And then I did a little zigzag, a 1-inch zigzag, which looks really good. But if you notice, all the corners are rounded. And they're rounded because this is not all the way full. I mean, it should be like that, because I fudged it, right? And so you're going to get rounded corners when you do that. And that's why your binding looks like that, if you are doing your binding that way, is because it's not set at the right width, and so it's going to get these weird rounded corners. And I don't like that. So let me show you a couple of quilt samples. So on this quilt right here, this little table runner, this one was probably a 2½ inch binding, and this one was hand sewn on the back. And nobody's going to pay me enough money to hand sew on binding for them, because I take very tiny stitches, and it takes me a very long time. And yeah, I'd have to charge you $1 million to do that. So that's hand sewn or bound on the front and then hand sewn on the back. On this quilt right here, this one has a real small piping, and I did the piping first, and then I sewed these doodads, and then it has a false flange right here that you have to hand sew, which is right here. I know you can't tell with this crazy fabric on the back, but that's how that one's done. On this quilt, it was sewn on the back. See, I have tried every version of sewing binding on. This one was sewn on the back, and then it was sewn with a straight stitch with monofilament thread on the front. And you can see this little flange, and I don't like that flange at all. And I don't like it being sewn down on the front, so I usually sew my binding on the front and then sew it down on the back. Trying to make the front look as best as possible, and I just don't like the flange look. I don't know why I put the binding on this one that way. Alright. On this quilt, the binding was sewn on the front, and then I used monofilament thread, and I actually sewed in the ditch from the front side and sewed the binding on. And it's a little difficult to get it even when you do that, but it looks the best from the front. And I didn't do a terrible job. I think it looks decent. And this quilt has been washed, so that's what it looks like. Here's a quilt I did for Quilter's World. And this binding was sewn on the front. And normally when I send in a quilt for one of the magazines, I'll hand bind it, but I didn't do this one. And I did a very small zigzag with the monofilament on the back, and I think this one looks really nice. And you can't really see it on the front because I actually got it pretty good. It looks pretty good. So those are the different ways that you can bind a quilt. And like I said, my favorite way is to sew it on the front and do a zigzag, a small zigzag where it looks like it's hand bound. So I'm going to show you the end result of the quilts in a second, but I also want to talk about something that happens a lot after you sew your binding together right here. And you go down to sew it down, and you get down here and it kind of bunches up and it wants to wrinkle, and that's just because your binding is too loose. So when you're sewing it together, maybe shift it over 1/4 of an inch, or you can cut it before you sew it together, and then hopefully that'll take some of that out. And this one is actually, I think this is actually bias binding I put on here, so it has a lot of stretch. If it's a binding with a lot of stretch, you can actually even sew it a little bit further to give yourself some room. And this one is sewn on by machine, 1/4 of an inch. This is a 2 1/4 inch binding, and then I can just fold it to the back and hopefully get it right where I want, which is about a 1/16 of an inch over the stitching line. So here's one of the quilts I did for the customer. And here's what my corners look like. I think they turned out really, really good. The corners turned out perfect, actually. And all 4 corners. Usually you can have one corner that doesn't come out, usually what happens. So this is sewn on the front, and it has a little zigzag, and it kind of looks like it was hand bound, and that's kind of the look I'm looking for, right? I want it to look like it was hand stitched. And that's what it looks like with the monofilament and a little zigzag. You don't want a big zigzag, just a tiny, tiny zigzag. And you can barely see it on the front here, next to the binding. If you get it on there really well, it'll be pretty close to the binding, which mine looks really good. I think this part right here is probably the only one that is a little bit further than normal, but for the most part it looks really good. And when you wash it, you're not really going to see that at all. So I still, like I said, I think this looks the best from the front and the back. I mean, with all the different methods, you're going to have to be okay with either it having a little stitching on the front, having a flange, you know, whatever. Of course, if you sew it on the front and hand stitch it, it's going to look the best, but not all of us want or can do that. So hopefully you found this helpful, and just make some samples and see what you like. Try different things, you know, try something I haven't tried, and see if you like putting your binding on like that. And if you're okay with just doing a flange, and you're okay with all the other ways, then that's okay too. I mean, half of my quilts have those flanges on them because I get lazy and I just do it that way, you know. So it's okay. You can just try different things. Try some piping. Piping is fun. Try, you know, some striped binding. That's a lot of fun, you know. Horizontal binding, whatever. Try some binding with some decorative stitching. Do something. Thanks.